The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Men in tailored suits and women in designer dresses mingled, their laughter mixing with the soft classical music playing in the background. This was no ordinary party. It was the annual charity gala hosted by Richard Kane, one of the city's wealthiest men. At 55, Richard had built his fortune in real estate, turning abandoned buildings into luxury apartments that most people in the city could only dream of affording. Sophia Chen hurried through the kitchen doors, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. At 19, she was younger than the other servers, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed perfectly. This job wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than most part-time work, and she needed every dollar for her education. Remember, don't make eye contact unless they speak to you first, the head server had warned during her training. These people don't want to know you exist unless they need something. Sophia nodded to herself, carefully making her way through clusters of guests. Most didn't notice her at all, simply reaching for drinks without pausing their conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes. I heard the symphony is struggling this year, a woman in a red dress said, taking a champagne flute without looking at Sophia. Such a shame. The arts are the first to suffer when money gets tight. That's why these fundraisers are so important, her companion replied, though I doubt half the people here could name a classical composer beyond Mozart. Sophia bit her lip to hide a smile. As a scholarship student at the Westwood Conservatory of Music, she could probably name more composers than most of the guests combined. Her thoughts drifted to the practice room waiting for her tomorrow morning. Her fingers itched to play, to lose herself in Chopin or Debussy instead of carrying drinks for people who would forget her face the moment she walked away. You there, girl? More champagne for Mr. Kane's table. Sophia snapped back to attention. The event coordinator was gesturing urgently toward the center of the room where Richard Kane sat, with his most important guests. With a quick nod, she headed to the kitchen for a fresh tray. The main table was intimidating. Richard Kane sat in the middle, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom suit probably worth more than Sophia's entire year of tuition. Despite being in his 50s, his face was surprisingly unlined, save for the creases around his eyes that deepened when he frowned, which seemed to be often. Sophia approached carefully, keeping her eyes down as instructed. She began serving from the left of Mr. Kane, working her way around. The guest barely acknowledged her presence, too engrossed in Richard's story about his latest development project. The city council tried to block it. Of course, Richard was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of someone rarely told no. Something about historical preservation, as if that crumbling theater had any real value left. What happened to the theater company? Asked a woman with diamond earrings that caught the light with every slight movement of her head. Richard waved his hand dismissively. They found another venue. Or they closed. I don't keep track. Progress requires change, and change creates winners and losers. Sophia reached Richard's place at the table, carefully leaning in to set down a fresh glass of champagne. Just as she placed it on the table, a guest at Richard's right suddenly pushed back his chair, bumping into her elbow. The champagne flute tipped, spilling its contents across the pristine white tablecloth and onto Richard Kane's lap. Time seemed to stop. The golden liquid spread across the expensive fabric of his pants, droplets sliding down onto his polished shoes. The table fell silent. I'm so sorry, sir, Sophia stammered, immediately pulling a cloth from her apron pocket. Let me help. Don't touch me, Richard said, his voice cutting through the air like ice. He stood slowly, looking down at his ruined suit, then at Sophia. His eyes were cold, calculating. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? I'm truly sorry, sir. It was an accident. The chair? Richard raised an eyebrow, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. So it's the furniture's fault now? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience. The event coordinator appeared at Sophia's side, horror written across her face. Mr. Kane, please accept our deepest apologies. We'll comp your dry cleaning, of course, and... It's not about the dry cleaning, Richard interrupted, his gaze still fixed on Sophia. It's about competence. About standards. He looked Sophia up and down. How old are you, girl? Sophia swallowed hard. 19, sir. 19, he repeated. And what do you do when you're not ruining charity events? The room had grown quieter. More people were watching now. some with embarrassment, others with the slight thrill of witnessing someone else's humiliation. "I'm a student, sir, at Westwood Conservatory." This seemed to catch Richard's interest. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Westwood? The music school?" When Sophia nodded, he gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "What do you study there?" "Piano, sir. Classical piano." Richard looked around the room as if inviting others to share in his amusement. "Piano? Well, isn't that interesting?" He gestured toward the grand piano sitting in the corner of the ballroom. It had been played earlier by a hired musician who had since taken a break. "We have a pianist among us, ladies and gentlemen." Sophia's face grew hot. She could feel dozens of eyes on her now. "Mr. Kane, perhaps we should let the young lady return to her duties," suggested an older man at the table. Clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, Richard ignored him. No, I'm curious now." He turned back to Sophia. "You spilled champagne on me because you were—" "What, daydreaming about Beethoven?" "It was an accident," Sophia repeated, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Tell you what," Richard said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a kind smile. "Since you've interrupted our evening, why don't you make it up to us? Show us what our charitable donations to arts education are producing these days." Sophia blinked in confusion. "Sir," Richard pointed to the piano, "play something. Prove that you're not just a clumsy server with delusions of grandeur." The event coordinator stepped forward again. "Mr. Kane, our hired pianist, will return shortly. I'm sure we can—" "I'm not interested in your hired help," Richard cut her off. "I want to hear what a Westwood student can do." He looked directly at Sophia again. "Unless, of course, you're not really a pianist." Sophia felt trapped. Every eye in the room was on her now. If she refused, she'd not only be humiliated but might lose her job. If she played poorly, it would be even worse. "The piano, Miss Chen," Sophia supplied. "Sophia Chen. Miss Chen, show us what you can do." With her heart pounding, Sophia handed her serving tray to another server. She walked slowly toward the piano, feeling as if her legs might give way beneath her. The ballroom seemed impossibly large now, the distance to the piano stretching on forever as conversations hushed and people turned to watch. She reached the instrument and ran her fingers lightly over the polished wood. It was a Steinway, far nicer than the worn practice pianos at school. Sophia sat down carefully on the bench, adjusting it slightly. From across the room, she could see Richard Kane watching with crossed arms and a smug expression. He expected her to fail, to embarrass herself further. Sophia took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. The familiar feeling of cool ivory beneath her fingertips calmed her slightly. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the staring faces, the whispers, Richard Kane's mocking smile. In her mind, she was back in her tiny apartment, playing on her second-hand keyboard with headphones because the walls were too thin for a real piano. She was practicing until her fingers ached, playing by ear the pieces she couldn't afford the sheet music for. She was remembering her mother's voice from years ago. "Music speaks when words can't, Sophia. Don't ever be afraid to let it speak for you." Sophia opened her eyes, straightened her back, and began to play. The first notes floated through the air like raindrops on still water. Sophia began with something gentle, the opening of Debussy's Clair de Lune, familiar enough that even the musically untrained might recognize it. Her fingers moved with a delicate precision that belied her nervousness. In the audience, a few people exchanged surprised glances. They had expected fumbling, perhaps some basic melody played with the hesitation of an amateur. Instead, the music flowed with a thoughtful touch that made several guests pause mid-conversation. Richard Kane remained standing, champagne stain forgotten for the moment. His expression hadn't changed, still expectant, still waiting for her to fail. Clair de Lune was pretty, but it was also a piece many intermediate players could manage. He took a sip of water, his eyes never leaving Sophia. At the piano, Sophia felt the room's energy shift. The initial whispers had died down. She could feel them listening now, really listening. She finished the opening section of Debussy and, without pausing, transitioned into something entirely different. The gentle moonlight of Debussy gave way to the thundering passion of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. Known among pianists as one of the most technically challenging pieces ever written, its opening seemed deceptively simple. But as Sophia's hands began to move faster, Covering more of the keyboard, the true complexity revealed itself. Her left hand struck deep, resonant chords while her right danced through intricate patterns that would leave most conservatory students in tears of frustration. The piece was normally played with an orchestra, but Sophia made the piano sing so completely that the missing instruments were hardly noticed. Near the back of the room, a server carrying a tray of appetizers stopped to listen, forgetting his duties for a moment. At a far table, an older woman with silver hair closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. And at the center table, Richard Kane slowly lowered himself back into his seat, his face unreadable. Sophia was no longer in the ballroom. In her mind, she was everywhere and nowhere, floating through the music, her body knowing exactly what to do without conscious thought. This was why she practiced until her back ached and her fingers cramped. This feeling of becoming one with the music, of speaking through it, was worth every sacrifice. Her hands moved with increasing speed and intensity as she reached the first major climax of the concerto. Sweat formed on her brow, but she didn't notice. A strand of dark hair came loose from her neat bun, falling across her face as she leaned into a particularly demanding passage. She didn't brush it away. Nothing existed now except the keys beneath her fingers and the music pouring from her soul. The hired pianist, who had returned from his break, stood in the doorway watching with his mouth slightly open. He played professionally at events like this every weekend, offering pleasant background music while people chatted and networked. But he never played like this, never with this abandon, this technical brilliance, this emotional depth. "Who is she?" He whispered to another server. "Just one of the catering staff," the server replied. "At least she was until about 5 minutes ago." As Sophia continued to play, memories flashed through her mind. Her mother bringing home an old upright piano when Sophia was 7, salvaged from a neighbor's garage sale. "It's out of tune," her mother had apologized, "but we'll fix it up." They never had enough money to tune it properly, but Sophia had loved it anyway, playing for hours by ear before she ever had a formal lesson. She remembered her high school music teacher's face when she first heard Sophia play, the shock, then the determined push to get her to apply for conservatory scholarships. "You have a gift," she had insisted when Sophia protested that they couldn't afford it. "Some doors will open if you knock hard enough." The memory gave her strength as she tackled the most difficult section of the piece, her hands flying across the keys at a speed that blurred in the eyes of the watching guests. A few people had taken out their phones, recording the unexpected performance. One woman, a regular donor to the symphony, was already texting her friend on the board of directors. Richard Kane sat completely still, the smugness gone from his face. In its place was something more complex, surprise certainly, but also a dawning recognition that he had severely misjudged the young woman he'd tried to humiliate. He was not a man accustomed to being wrong. Next to him, an older gentleman leaned over. "I believe you've discovered a diamond in the rough, Richard," he said quietly. Richard didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on Sophia, watching her transformation from invisible server to commanding artist. The same hands that had spilled champagne on his suit were now creating something so beautiful, it made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. As the piece reached its conclusion, Sophia played the final chords with such force that the piano seemed to lift off the ground. The last note hung in the air for a long moment before fading away, leaving an electric silence in its wake. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then the applause began, scattered at first, then building into a wave that crashed through the ballroom. People rose to their feet, some calling bravo, and others simply clapping with stunned expressions. A few dabbed at tears they hadn't realized were falling. Sophia remained seated at the piano bench, suddenly aware again of where she was and what had just happened. The return to reality was jarring. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered them to her lap. She looked up to see dozens of faces staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to admiration. Near the back, she spotted the hired pianist applauding with particular enthusiasm, a look of professional respect on his face. The event coordinator was beaming, all thoughts of the earlier mishap forgotten in the glow of having discovered such talent at her event. And at the center table, Richard Kane still sat, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. When he noticed Sophia looking his way, he schooled his features back into careful neutrality. He stood slowly and approached the piano, the room quieting as people waited to see what would happen next. Sophia rose on unsteady legs to face him. She had no idea what to expect. More ridicule? Grudging acknowledgement? Whatever came, she had shown him and everyone else in the room who she really was. For a moment, they had seen beyond her server's uniform to the musician within. No one could take that away from her. Richard stopped a few feet from her, his tall frame imposing even without his usual imperious expression. Up close, Sophia could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight gray at his temples that his expensive haircut couldn't quite hide. For the first time, she looked directly into his face without fear. "That was Rachmaninoff's third," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. Sophia nodded, surprised he had recognized the piece. "Yes, sir. Most professional pianists won't touch it. Too demanding." "It's worth the work," Sophia replied simply. A woman in a blue dress approached them, interrupting the strange moment. "My dear, that was extraordinary," she gushed, taking Sophia's hand between both of hers. "I'm on the board of the City Symphony. We have a young artists program. You must audition." Before Sophia could respond, others had gathered around, offering business cards, asking questions, completely ignoring Richard Kane for perhaps the first time at one of his own events. He stepped back, watching as Sophia was surrounded by admirers, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure. The head server appeared at Richard's side. "Sir, would you like to change? We have a spare jacket that might fit." Richard glanced down at his stained suit as if just remembering it. "No," he said distantly. "It's fine." Across the room, someone had pulled out their phone and was showing others a video they'd just posted. "It's already got 50 likes, the woman was saying excitedly. "I tagged the conservatory. They should be promoting this girl." Richard watched as Sophia tentatively accepted a business card from a well-known music producer, her hand still shaking slightly. The same hands that had spilled champagne on him 30 minutes ago had now completely changed the trajectory of her life. And his? Richard wasn't sure yet, but as he stood there, slightly apart from the crowd now forming around the piano, he felt something shift inside him. A small crack in the hard shell of certainty he'd built around himself over decades of wealth and power. "Mr. Kane?" The event coordinator approached cautiously. "Would you like us to continue with the program? Your speech is scheduled next." Richard looked at his watch, then back at Sophia, now being interviewed by a local arts reporter who happened to be covering the gala. "The program can wait," he said quietly. "I think we've just witnessed something more important." 3 days after the gala, Sophia sat in a practice room at Westwood Conservatory, staring at her phone in disbelief. The video of her performance had over 2 million views. Her inbox was flooded with messages from strangers, music lovers, and even a few record labels. Most surprising were the emails from 3 different prestigious piano competitions, inviting her to apply with the application fees waived, a courtesy usually extended only to recommended students. "I still can't believe this is happening," she said to Lisa, her roommate and fellow piano student who was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her. Lisa shook her head, scrolling through the comments on the video. "Look at this one. The way her hands move should be physically impossible." And this. "I've heard professional recordings of Rach 3 that don't have this much soul. Sophia, you're famous." "I'm not famous," Sophia protested, though her cheeks flushed with pleasure. "It'll blow over in a week. That's how the internet works." "Not this time," Lisa insisted. "Professor Wu wants to see you, by the way. She called me when she couldn't reach you." Sophia checked her phone again and saw 3 missed calls from her piano instructor. "I should go now," she said, gathering her sheet music. "I have so much to tell her." "Wait," Lisa grabbed her arm. "There's something else you should know. People are talking about Kane." Sophia paused. She hadn't thought much about Richard Kane since that night, too caught up in the whirlwind that followed. "What about him?" "Apparently he left right after your performance. Didn't even give his speech. The gossip is that he was embarrassed about how he treated you." Lisa grinned. "Some people are saying he deserved it after what he did to the old theater district." Sophia frowned. "What did he do?" "You don't know? His company bought up most of the buildings in the old arts district last year, kicked out all the small theaters and music venues to build luxury apartments. There was a whole protest about it. My brother was involved. He used to perform at one of those theaters." Lisa's voice had grown bitter. A lot of local artists lost their spaces. Sophia thought about this as she walked across campus to Professor Wu's office. The connection felt strange, almost like fate. The man who had tried to humiliate her was the same one who had displaced so many other artists. Professor Wu was waiting, a rare smile on her usually stern face. At 65, she had been teaching piano for over 40 years and was not easily impressed. "Sophia," she said, rising from behind her desk. "Please sit down." Sophia took a seat, clutching her bag nervously. "I've watched the video," Professor Wu said without preamble. 17 times. 17? Sophia couldn't hide her surprise. "The first time to see if it was really you. The second time to confirm what I'd heard. The remaining 15 times to study your technique." Professor Wu leaned forward. "Why have you been holding back in your lessons?" "I haven't been," Sophia began, but stopped when she saw her teacher's raised eyebrow. "I don't know. Maybe I was afraid of making mistakes." "Fear is the enemy of greatness," Professor Wu said simply. "You played without fear that night." "Why?" Sophia thought about it. "Because I had nothing to lose. No one expected anything from me." Professor Wu nodded slowly. "And now everyone expects everything," she sighed. "That is the burden of talent revealed. But we will discuss this more in your lessons, which, by the way, I'm doubling. You're not prepared for what's coming." "What's coming?" Sophia asked. "Opportunity," Professor Wu replied. "And with it, pressure. Speaking of which, Dean Harris wants to see you immediately. I believe the symphony called him." 40 minutes later, Sophia emerged from the dean's office in a daze. The City Symphony wanted her to perform as a special guest at their next concert. The dean had been practically glowing with pride. A student from his school getting this kind of recognition would help their funding immeasurably. As she walked across campus, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Chen, this is Vivian Lee, Mr. Kane's assistant. He would like to speak with you. Please call at your convenience." Sophia stopped walking, staring at the message. Why would Richard Kane want to speak with her now? To apologize? She somehow doubted it. Men like him rarely admitted they were wrong. More likely, he wanted to do damage control. The video had tagged him by name in many of the shares and not in a flattering light. She decided to ignore the message for now. She had more important things to think about, like how she was going to prepare for a symphony performance in just 3 weeks while keeping up with her classes. That evening, as Sophia practiced in her tiny apartment, her phone rang again. The same unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, focusing instead on the difficult passage she'd been working on for the past hour. A few minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Sophia frowned. It was almost 10 o'clock and she wasn't expecting anyone. She peered through the peephole and was startled to see a woman in an expensive-looking suit standing in the hallway. She opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Sophia Chen?" The woman smiled professionally. "I'm Vivian Lee, Mr. Kane's assistant. I apologize for coming unannounced, but Mr. Kane was quite insistent about speaking with you." Sophia's surprise must have shown on her face because Vivian added quickly, "He's waiting in the car. He asked me to see if you would be willing to meet with him briefly." "Now?" Sophia glanced down at her worn sweatpants and faded t-shirt. "I'm not exactly dressed for a meeting." "It's not a formal meeting," Vivian assured her. "Just a conversation he feels is important. 10 minutes at most." Curiosity won out over caution. "Let me grab a jacket." Outside, a sleek black car idled by the curb, looking distinctly out of place in Sophia's working-class neighborhood. Vivian opened the back door and gestured for Sophia to get in. Richard Kane sat inside, looking somehow smaller without the backdrop of his glamorous charity event. He wore a casual button-down shirt rather than a suit, though Sophia guessed it still cost more than her monthly rent. "Ms. Chen," he said as she slid into the seat across from him. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." Up close, in the dim light of the car, Sophia could see that he looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there at the gala. "Your assistant didn't give me much choice," Sophia replied, then immediately regretted her tone. Whatever his faults, this man could potentially influence her career, for better or worse. To her surprise, Richard smiled slightly. "Vivian is very persistent. It's why I hired her." The smile faded. "I'll be direct, Ms. Chen. I behaved poorly at the gala." Sophia blinked, not having expected an actual apology. "I embarrassed you publicly with the intention of putting you in your place," he continued. Instead, you showed everyone there, including me, exactly what your place is. He looked out the window at the rundown apartment building where Sophia lived. I've learned you're on scholarship, that you work 3 jobs to pay for living expenses, that your mother was a cleaner who saved for years to buy you your first keyboard. Sophia stiffened. You've been investigating me. I like to know who I'm dealing with, Richard replied unapologetically. I also know that despite your talent, you're struggling. The scholarship covers tuition but not room and board. Your apartment has faulty wiring and a landlord who ignores repair requests. You practice at school because your neighbors complain about the noise even when you use headphones with your keyboard. Why are you telling me things I already know? Sophia asked, growing uncomfortable with how much this stranger knew about her life. Richard leaned forward slightly. Because I have a proposition for you. Sophia's guard went up immediately. She'd heard stories about wealthy men offering help to young women with strings attached. What kind of proposition? Richard must have read her expression because he shook his head. Nothing inappropriate. A business arrangement. I'm establishing a new foundation for young artists displaced by urban development. The foundation needs a face and inaugural recipient. I'd like that to be you. Why me? Sophia asked, though she was beginning to understand. Because you feel guilty? Partly, Richard admitted with surprising candor. But also because you're exactly the kind of talent the foundation is meant to support. The grant would cover your living expenses, provide a better apartment near campus with proper soundproofing, and fund your competition entries and travel for the next 3 years. Sophia sat back, her mind racing. It sounded too good to be true. What's the catch? You'd need to be the public face of the foundation. Appearances at fundraisers, interviews about how the grant has helped you. Essentially, you'd help me convince other wealthy people to contribute. So I'd be your success story, Sophia said slowly. Your redemption narrative. For a moment, Richard looked taken aback by her directness. Then he nodded. I suppose that's one way to look at it. The less cynical view is that we both get something we need. You get financial support to pursue your gift without working 3 jobs. The foundation gets a compelling first recipient who clearly deserves the help. Sophia looked out the window at her building, thinking of the practice room at school where she'd have to be in just 7 hours. Thinking of the shifts she'd have to work this weekend instead of preparing for her symphony debut. I need time to consider it, she said finally. Of course. Richard handed her a business card. Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless of what you decide about the symphony performance. How did you know about that? Sophia asked, though she wasn't really surprised anymore. Richard's expression was unreadable in the dim light. I serve on their board of directors. It was my recommendation, actually. As Sophia stepped out of the car, Richard added, whatever you decide about the foundation, I hope you'll accept the symphony invitation. They need the audience, and the audience deserves to hear you play. Watching the black car drive away, Sophia stood on the sidewalk, the business card cool between her fingers. The night had taken an unexpected turn, much like her life had 3 days ago. Upstairs, she found Lisa waiting anxiously. Where did you go? I came by to borrow your theory notes and saw you getting into some fancy car. Sophia sat down heavily on their worn couch. I think Richard Kane just offered to change my life. The billionaire who tried to humiliate you? Lisa's eyes widened. What did he want? Redemption, I think, Sophia said, looking down at the card in her hand. And maybe something more. Are you going to accept? Lisa asked. Sophia gazed out the window at the city lights, feeling as though she was standing on the edge of a cliff. I don't know yet, but I think I'm about to find out what happens when someone like me enters someone like his world. 2 weeks flew by in a blur of practice rooms, sore fingers and sleepless nights. Sophia had decided to put Richard Kane's offer aside until after her symphony performance. One life-changing event at a time, she told herself. The City Symphony had given her 2 pieces to prepare. A short Chopin nocturne to open her segment, followed by the same Rachmaninoff concerto that had catapulted her to sudden fame. This time she would have a full orchestra behind her, a thought that filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. Your tempo is rushing again, Professor Wu said during their 4th extra lesson that week. The older woman hadn't left Sophia's side for more than a day since the video went viral, rearranging her schedule to provide daily coaching. Sophia sighed, flexing her cramping fingers. I know. I'm trying to stay calm, but when I think about all those people watching, Then don't think about them, Professor Wu said simply. Think about the music. It has survived hundreds of years and will survive hundreds more. You are just its vessel for a brief moment. That perspective helped, though Sophia still felt overwhelmed by how quickly her life was changing. She had quit 2 of her 3 jobs, keeping only the weekend library position that allowed her to study between tasks. Her school friends looked at her differently now, some with admiration, others with a hint of jealousy. Reporters had tried to contact her for interviews, which the conservatory's press office now handled, shielding her from the worst of the attention. Through it all, Richard Kane's business card sat on her desk, a constant reminder of the decision awaiting her after the performance. Sometimes late at night, she would pick it up and turn it over in her hands, wondering what her mother would have advised. Take the opportunity, but keep your dignity, probably. Her mother had been practical that way. The night before the concert, Sophia couldn't sleep. She paced her small apartment, going over the music in her head, her fingers dancing across imaginary keys. Around 3 a.m., she bundled up against the autumn chill and walked to campus, using her student ID to access the practice rooms that were open 24 hours. To her surprise, she wasn't alone. Through the window of another practice room, she saw Lisa hunched over a piano, her face intense with concentration. Sophia watched for a moment, realizing with a pang that she hadn't really spoken to her friend in days. She had been so wrapped up in her own sudden success that she'd forgotten Lisa was preparing for an important recital of her own. "Hey," Sophia said softly, knocking on the open door. "Can't sleep either?" Lisa looked up, startled, then smiled tiredly. "My recital's in 2 days. Not as big as your symphony debut, but big for me." "I'm sorry I haven't been around," Sophia said, meaning it. "Everything's been so crazy. It's okay." "I get it." Lisa made room on the bench. "Want to run through your pieces one more time? I could play the orchestra reduction for you." For the next 2 hours, they played together like they used to, before viral videos and billionaire offers had complicated things. By the time dawn broke, Sophia felt calmer than she had in weeks. "You're going to be amazing tonight," Lisa said as they walked back to their apartments, the sky lightening to a pale blue above them. "Just remember who you are when you're up there with all those fancy people." "Who am I?" Sophia asked, only half joking. "The girl who plays with her whole heart," Lisa replied simply. "The girl who made Richard Kane speechless." Later that day, as Sophia stood backstage at Riverside Concert Hall in a borrowed black dress, those words came back to her. The symphony's artistic director had just finished introducing her to the packed audience, mentioning both her viral performance and her status as a scholarship student at Westwood. "And now, please welcome to the stage Sophia Chen." The applause was polite but curious as Sophia walked onto the stage. This audience was different from the internet viewers who had watched her video millions of times. These were season ticket holders, classical music enthusiasts, donors in expensive clothes who came to every symphony performance. They were reserving judgment. As she took her seat at the gleaming grand piano, Sophia scanned the audience briefly. In the 3rd row, she spotted Professor Wu, sitting straighter than anyone around her. Near the back was Lisa, who had somehow gotten a ticket at the last minute. And in one of the side boxes, slightly shadowed, sat Richard Kane. He wasn't looking at his phone or whispering to companions like some of the other box occupants. He was watching her with complete attention. Sophia nodded to the conductor, took a deep breath, and began the Chopin Nocturne. The piece was gentle, intimate, a conversation between close friends rather than a speech to a crowd. She let her fingers caress the keys, thinking of late-night practice sessions and her mother falling asleep in their small living room while Sophia played. When the last note of the nocturne faded, there was a moment of perfect silence before the applause began, warmer now, appreciative. Sophia smiled briefly, then readied herself for the Rachmaninoff. This was the real test. The orchestra began the opening theme, and Sophia closed her eyes for a few seconds, feeling the music build around her. When she joined in, everything else fell away. The audience, the pressure, the decisions waiting to be made. There was only the piano, the orchestra, and Rachmaninoff's soaring melodies and thunderous chords. She played with a freedom that surprised even her, taking risks with tempo and dynamics that she hadn't dared try in rehearsal. The orchestra followed her lead, the conductor's eyes wide but his hands steady as he guided the musicians to match her intensity. By the final movement, Sophia was no longer thinking at all. Her body knew what to do, her fingers finding the right keys through thousands of hours of practice and a lifetime of loving music. When the final chords crashed through the concert hall, she was as swept up in the moment as anyone in the audience. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the hall erupted. People rose to their feet, applauding with an enthusiasm rarely seen in classical concerts. Someone shouted, "Brava!" from the balcony, and others took up the cry. Flowers appeared on stage, handed up by audience members in the front row. Sophia stood breathless and dizzy with emotion to take her bows. She gestured to the orchestra, then the conductor, acknowledging their part in the performance. As the applause continued, she looked up at the box where Richard Kane sat. He was standing with everyone else, his expression unreadable at this distance. The reception afterward was a whirlwind of congratulations and introductions. The symphony's board members all wanted to meet her, as did several music critics and representatives from recording companies. Professor Wu stood protectively at her side, fielding questions about Sophia's training and future plans with practiced ease. "You need to get some air," the professor said after an hour, noticing Sophia's overwhelmed expression. "Go to the terrace for a few minutes. I'll keep them busy." Grateful, Sophia slipped away through a side door that led to a small terrace overlooking the city. The night air was cool on her flushed face, and she leaned against the stone railing, taking deep breaths. Below her, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars. "Remarkable performance," said a voice behind her. She turned to see Richard Kane standing in the doorway, holding 2 glasses of water. He offered one to her. "Thank you," Sophia said, taking the glass. She wasn't sure if she was thanking him for the water or the compliment. "The critics are already writing their reviews," he said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. The words "discovery of the decade" are being thrown around. Sophia sipped her water, unsure how to respond to that. "Have you thought about my offer?" Richard asked after a moment. "I have," Sophia replied. "I'm just not sure I want to be anyone's redemption story." Richard looked at her with something like respect. "Fair enough. What about your own story, then? What do you want that to be?" Sophia considered the question. "I want to play piano. I want to finish school without working myself to exhaustion. I want to see how far I can go with music." She turned to face him directly. "But I don't want to be used. What if the foundation were different?" Richard suggested. "Not just about me giving money and you being the grateful recipient. What if you had a say in how it operated? Who it helped?" "You'd give me that kind of input?" Sophia asked skeptically. "I would," he replied. "Because after tonight it's clear that you understand something I don't. What young artists really need. I can provide resources, but you could provide direction." Sophia looked out at the city again, thinking. "The old theater district. The one your company demolished. What if the foundation helped the displaced artists find new spaces? What if it funded community arts programs in neighborhoods like mine?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "That would be expensive and complicated. So is buying a clean conscience," Sophia replied. To her surprise, Richard laughed, a genuine sound without the polished edge she'd heard in his voice before. "You don't pull any punches, do you?" "I can't afford to," she said simply. Richard nodded slowly. "All right, Ms. Chen. Let's discuss what this foundation could really be. Not tomorrow. You should enjoy tonight's success. But soon." He handed her a different business card, this one with his personal number handwritten on the back. "Call me when you're ready. No assistance, no formalities. Just a conversation about possibilities." As he turned to leave, Sophia called after him. "Why are you doing this?" "Really?" Richard paused in the doorway, his profile silhouetted against the light from inside. "Because you made me remember something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "What it feels like to be moved by something real." He glanced back at her. "Good night, Miss Chen, and thank you for the music." After he left, Sophia stayed on the terrace a while longer, turning the card over in her fingers. Through the open door, she could hear the buzz of the reception continuing, her name mentioned in excited conversations. Her old life seemed very far away suddenly, as distant as the tiny pinpricks of light from apartment windows across the city. She knew that whatever she decided about Richard's offer, there would be no going back to the way things were before. The girl who had spilled champagne on a billionaire's suit no longer existed. In her place stood someone new, someone who had found her voice and was just beginning to understand its power. Taking one last deep breath of night air, Sophia slipped the card into her pocket and went back inside, ready to face whatever came next. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of change. Spring had arrived, painting the city with fresh colors that seemed to mirror the new chapter in Sophia's life. She stood at the podium in a renovated theater, trying not to fidget with the note cards in her hands. Behind her hung a simple banner, Chen Kane Foundation for the Arts Community Showcase. The audience seats were filled with an unusual mix. Wealthy donors in expensive clothes sitting alongside families from working-class neighborhoods, all there to witness the foundation's first public event. "Thank you all for coming," Sophia began, her voice steadier than she felt. Public speaking still made her nervous, though she'd gotten better at it over the past few months. "When I was growing up, music wasn't something fancy or distant. It was part of everyday life. My mother couldn't afford expensive lessons, but she found ways to surround me with music, community programs, church choirs, a second-hand keyboard from a garage sale." She glanced toward the back of the theater where Richard Kane stood, arms folded, watching with an intensity that had become familiar. They'd spent countless hours debating the foundation's direction, each meeting a careful dance of compromise and conviction. "That's why the Chen Kane Foundation isn't just about finding the next concert pianist or violin prodigy," Sophia continued. "It's about making sure every child has the chance to discover what music or art might mean in their lives. It's about spaces like this one," she gestured around the renovated theater, "remaining accessible to all artists, not just those who can afford high rents." The journey to this moment hadn't been smooth. There had been arguments, Richard pushing for prestigious scholarship programs at elite institutions, Sophia insisting on community arts spaces in underserved neighborhoods. There had been compromise, yes to the scholarships, but also yes to affordable practice spaces and instruments for schools that couldn't afford them. Tonight, you'll hear performances from people who represent the full spectrum of what this foundation supports, Sophia said, from conservatory students to community theater groups, from classical music to hip-hop, from traditional to experimental, because art belongs to everyone. As she stepped away from the podium to applause, Sophia felt a flutter of pride. 6 months ago, she would have never imagined herself here, helping to guide a multi-million-dollar foundation. Sometimes it still felt like a dream, especially when she caught glimpses of her name alongside Richard's on official documents. The showcase began with a youth orchestra from a neighborhood much like the one where Sophia had grown up. The children played with more enthusiasm than precision, but their faces shone with the joy of creating music together. Following them was a jazz quartet, a poetry collective, a traditional dance group, and several solo performers. Backstage, in between introducing acts, Sophia found a moment of quiet. She pulled out her phone and smiled at the latest text from Lisa, who was currently on tour in Europe with a chamber music ensemble. "Killing it in Vienna tonight. Send pics from the showcase, miss you." Sophia had worried that her sudden success would damage their friendship, but if anything, it had grown stronger. Lisa had been her sounding board during the tense early negotiations with Richard, helping her stay grounded when the pressure threatened to overwhelm her. 5 minutes until your performance," the stage manager said, poking his head into the small dressing room. Sophia nodded, slipping her phone away. She hadn't initially planned to play tonight. She wanted the focus to be on the foundation's recipients, not herself. But Richard had insisted, arguing that her story was what had inspired the foundation in the first place. "You don't need to prove anything," he'd said during their last meeting before the showcase. "Just play something that matters to you." When she stepped onto the stage again, the light seemed brighter, the audience larger. She sat at the piano, not the concert grand she now played regularly at professional venues, but a well-loved upright that had been donated to one of their community programs. It felt right for tonight. "This piece isn't famous like Rachmaninoff," she said into the microphone positioned near the piano. "It's something my mother used to hum while she cleaned houses. I never knew where it came from until recently, when I discovered it was a folk song from her village in China. I've arranged it for piano, and tonight I'm playing it for her, and for everyone who gives their children the gift of music, whatever form that takes." The melody was simple but haunting, a winding path of notes that spoke of distant mountains and the smell of rain on dust. Sophia played it softly at first, then with growing confidence adding harmonies and counter melodies that honored the original while making it something new. She ended with a gentle open chord that seemed to ask a question rather than provide an answer. The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, a shared breath between performer and audience. Then came the applause, warm, appreciative, but more importantly, genuine. As Sophia took her bow, she caught Richard's eye. He gave her a small nod that contained more respect than any effusive praise could have conveyed. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Not quite friendship, but a partnership built on mutual recognition of what the other brought to their shared mission. After the final performers, a hip-hop dance crew from the city's west side, had taken their bows, the formal portion of the evening gave way to a reception. Donors mingled with artists, contact information was exchanged, and promises of support were made. Sophia moved through the crowd, still somewhat uncomfortable with networking but getting better at it by necessity. "Ms. Chen," a familiar voice said behind her. Sophia turned to find Richard, looking somewhat out of place with his designer suit among the more casually dressed artists. "Mr. Kane," she replied with a small smile. They still maintained this formal address in public, though in private planning meetings they had gradually shifted to first names. "Successful evening," he said, glancing around at the animated conversations taking place throughout the lobby. The city arts commissioner seemed impressed. "The children's orchestra won him over," Sophia said. "He's promising support for their summer program." Richard nodded approvingly. "And you? Are you satisfied with how things are progressing?" Sophia considered the question carefully. The past 6 months had been a constant push and pull, fighting for programs she believed in, learning when to compromise, discovering the complex realities of running a foundation. There had been victories and disappointments in equal measure. "I think we're on the right path," she said finally, "though I still wish we could have saved more of the old theater district." A shadow crossed Richard's face. The theater district remained a sore point between them. His company had already demolished most of it before they established the foundation. "We preserved what we could," he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "I know," Sophia acknowledged. She had learned when to press an issue and when to let it rest. "The renovation of this space means a lot to the community." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the diverse crowd of people whose lives the foundation had begun to touch. A young girl in a bright yellow dress ran past them, clutching a violin case and laughing. "My board thinks I've gone soft," Richard said suddenly, his tone lighter than his words. "Apparently focusing on community arts doesn't align with my cutthroat reputation." Sophia couldn't help but smile. "And what do you think?" Richard seemed to choose his next words with unusual care. "I think that night at the gala, when I tried to embarrass you, I was the one who got the wake-up call I needed." He looked around the theater lobby. "This isn't about redemption anymore, if it ever was. It's about remembering why any of this matters." "The music?" Sophia asked. "The humanity in it," Richard corrected. "Something I'd forgotten after years of treating everything as a transaction or an asset." It was perhaps the most personal thing he'd ever said to her. Sophia recognized the significance of the moment but didn't draw attention to it. Instead, she simply nodded. "There's still a lot of work to do." "There is," Richard agreed, his businessman's practicality returning. "The summer programs need finalization, and we need to review the scholarship applications by next month. And I have that concert tour to prepare for," Sophia added. Her career as a pianist had flourished alongside her foundation work, with international performances now filling her calendar. "How are you managing all of it?" Richard asked, and she caught a note of genuine concern in his voice. Sophia thought about her hectic schedule, divided between practice, performances, foundation work, and finishing her degree. It was overwhelming at times, but in a way that felt purposeful. "I'm figuring it out day by day," she said honestly. "But I wouldn't change it." A board member approached, requesting Richard's attention for an important donor conversation. Before he walked away, he turned to Sophia once more. "That piece you played tonight," he said, "your mother's song. Would you consider recording it? Not for commercial release, but for the foundation. Something we could share with the programs." Sophia felt a sudden tightness in her throat. Her mother had never lived to see any of this. The symphony performances, the foundation, the opportunities that had opened up. But somehow her simple melody had reached hundreds of people tonight. "I'd like that," she managed to say. Richard gave her another of his small, respectful nods and moved away to speak with the donor. Left alone for a moment, Sophia looked around the theater that had nearly been lost to luxury condominiums but now buzzed with creative energy. Children from the youth orchestra showed their instruments to interested donors. Art students explained their work to community members. A small group had formed around the piano, where one of the scholarship recipients was demonstrating jazz improvisation. None of this would have existed without that moment of humiliation at the gala, when a wealthy man had tried to put her in her place and instead discovered he was the one who needed to change. The thought still amazed her. Sophia's phone buzzed with a text from Professor Wu. "Proud of you tonight. But don't forget, Beethoven's sonata needs work. Lesson tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp." Sophia smiled. Some things hadn't changed. Even with all her success, she was still a student with much to learn. She texted back a quick confirmation before slipping her phone away and rejoining the celebration. As she moved through the crowd, Sophia caught fragments of conversation about upcoming projects, collaborations, and dreams for the future. The foundation was no longer just a concept or a promise. It was becoming a living, growing thing with a momentum of its own. And in its unlikely beginning, a spilled glass of champagne, a moment of cruelty, and a piece of music played with nothing to lose, was a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful changes come from the most unexpected places.